When Thomas Jefferson and John Adams met in June 1775, both were already well known to those pushing for the rights of the American colonies. Jefferson arrived in Philadelphia in a carriage pulled by a team of 4 horses, accompanied by 3 enslaved men. Adams was plainer, poorer, a patriot most ardent and pure. For all their differences, they were Yankee and Cavalier, rotund and statuesque. Both would soon be joined in what Jefferson had called the American story. When the delegates to the Second Continental Congress met at the Pennsylvania State House, a new sense of solidarity had grown among them, forged over a dozen years of struggle, and crystallized that momentous April during the battles of Lexington and Concord. By the spring of 1776, it had become clear that a group of draftsmen would need to tackle what Adams called the Great Question: independency. Adams, for all his brilliance, was unpersuasive, even toxic. A draft in his hand, he knew, would generate twice the criticism and gain half the traction. Jefferson, by contrast, knew the value and wisdom of silence. Silver-penned and lead-tongued, the young Jefferson emerged as the essential Virginian to hold the quill. It was a job for which Adams was desperate, and that Jefferson would have done almost anything to avoid. The drafting committee met for the first time on June 11th. There were 5 of them: Robert Livingston, Roger Sherman, and Benjamin Franklin joined Jefferson and Adams in framing the case for independence. They assigned the work of drafting the Declaration of Independence to Jefferson. By his own account, the role he played was closer to that of scribe than author. Neither aiming at originality of principle or sentiment, the Declaration was intended to be an expression of the American mind, he told Richard Henry Lee. Jefferson was a large-scale slaveholder in a commonwealth where enslaved people comprised roughly half the population. Adams was a free labor man from a colony whose enslaved population hovered around the 2% mark, and which would abolish slavery within a decade of the Declaration's drafting. Both men loathed the institution, but in Congress, there was little consensus and even less shared will on the subject. Jefferson had raged against the slave trade, proclaiming that the abolition of domestic slavery is the great object of desire in those colonies. Now, he poured his fury into his draft of the Declaration, which included a lengthy broadside against the transatlantic slave trade, calling it a cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him. He blamed the king, a pretended Christian, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. The passage was ultimately removed in its entirety, in the largest single change the delegates imposed upon the draft. Years later, Adams recalled the severe criticism which resulted in striking out several of the most oratorical paragraphs. Jefferson is said to have silently seethed through it all. On July 4th, 1776, the revision, however removed from that early draft, became the country's Originary Speech Act. Adams sensed the momentousness, referring to it then and afterwards as the most memorable epocha in the history of America. Jefferson's impression was much more modest. On July 8th, he sent Richard Henry Lee the version passed by Congress and his original draft, offering, "You will judge whether it is the better or worse for the critics." The years ahead would strain the civic friendship of Jefferson and Adams. Allied in the cause of independence, they came to hold divergent visions of the country they had helped to create and would each come to lead. For a time, they would find enough common ground to bridge their considerable differences. But by the end of that decade, the heat of politics would burn them both. In March 1801, when Jefferson succeeded Adams to the nation's highest office, Adams would not be there to witness the first peaceful transfer of power in the history of a modern republic. The divide proved long, but not permanent. After 11 years, Adams broke the silence, and they began to correspond regularly. Adams told his longtime friend and sometime enemy, "You and I ought not to die before we have explained ourselves to each other." Explanation was the crucial work of the Declaration and remains essential to American progress even still. Both men died on July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration's signing.